Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing. Okay, ready?
Welcome to Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
optimal wellness
brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Have you seen this movie, Brittany Runs a Marathon?
Brittany Runs a Marathon. It's a couple years old, but I do remember it. It's very funny.
The overarching narrative of her life is that she thinks of herself and others think of her as though she's a loser a little bit.
A bit of a mess.
Her
life is in shambles.
That's right. Something happens. I'm not going to give too much away, but something happens and then she takes up running and it completely redefines who she is.
Starting to feel like everyone's lives are going places and mine's sort of stuck. My whole life, the world told me I was lazy because the way I look. I want to run the New York City Marathon.
I think that is such a good idea.
You changing your life was never about your weight. It was about you taking responsibility for yourself.
I have seen this movie, yes, but why are we talking about this movie?
Because it's about narrative and wellness and taking control of your wellness story. Yeah. And there's a new book out, Once Upon a Leader, Finding the Story at the Heart of Your Leadership. Why we're talking about it, why a podcast about optimal performance is talking about it, is because it can also be applied to wellness. Like if you think about getting fit, gaining control of our weight, if you miss a workout, you've got to think about it as this journey and you're the hero in your journey. And setbacks will happen, but narrative and storytelling is so important to that process and keeping at it over time. And that's what this book is all about. We have the authors, Rick Lash and Christine Miners. They're in today talking to Medcan CEO Shaun Francis.
So whether you're an executive, the leader of an organization, or if you're just some random schmo like Brittany, we think this podcast has something in it for you.
I'm Chris.
I'm Jazz. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think. Christine Miners is the Managing Director of Leadership and Talent Management at Verity International Limited, which is an HR consulting firm, and she has more than 20 years of experience leading talent management functions. Her co-author, Rick Lash, is a senior associate at Verity International, and he's worked for over 3 decades as a trusted advisor and executive coach to Fortune 500 executives and their teams. He also received his PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto.
Their new book is all about taking charge of your leadership story and how finding personal meaning and purpose is intrinsic to your success and to your wellness.
Okay, amazing. That sounds great. Here is Shaun Francis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shaun Francis, CEO of Medcan and the host of Eat, Move, Think podcast. I'm really excited to have both Christine Miners and Rick Lash with me today, who have an exciting new book out on leadership. Really looking forward to talking to you about the topic. I know it's something that we're all thinking about, whether it's our businesses or our governments, and with all the difficulties we're facing on a variety of fronts, how does leadership, how can it change things for us? To kick off, why don't we just chat about the journey of this book and perhaps, both your personal leadership stories, which I know inspired you to write it.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start, Shaun. In terms of my work, of having worked with executives for the last nearly 40 years, time and time again, what came up was their inner story. The story that they told themselves about who they were as individuals and who they were as leaders was often getting in their way. It was either fragmented, it was difficult for them to figure out, how their past was currently influencing, how they showed up as leaders, and really struggled with how, who they are and what they do, and trying to close the gap that they were experiencing between it. And so, it became clear to me, early on that, we were sort of missing a large part of what it takes to be an effective leader. We often focus on competencies and behaviors and developing new skills, but that nobody was really talking about this sort of, as Christine and I often talk, this missing whole, which is their, the stories that they tell themselves about who they are and why they lead.
Yeah, and I guess, my journey is a little bit different. I spent the first 16 years of my career or so in industry, running leadership development inside organizations, and that really was my passion. It's formed much of my career. I mean, Rick and I met probably about 16 years ago and started working together, but prior to that, I worked inside a number of different organizations. And I think one of the frustrating pieces for me was I always felt like there was this gap, there was this hole in the approach to developing executive leaders. And I had this burning desire to address the gap, but not really knowing how. And I think this is a book that Rick's been trying to write for years. And he sort of just kind of on a whim one day said, hey, let's write it together. And so we wrote the book at the same time that we were working with cohorts of executives. And so we could apply our research, we could apply our theories, the concepts, real time in the moment with real executives and actually see the transformation happening.
Obviously, there's been many leadership books written, thousands and thousands. Your narrative seems to distinguish yours perhaps from others, but did you settle on that because you saw that as one of the most important elements or something that might distinguish you from the pack?
It's interesting. The idea of narrative is well documented, but what's been less documented is really the how-to. And so many executive leaders, while they kind of understand the concept that my leadership story is important, the story I tell myself about who I am as a leader is important, it matters to my leadership, there's been very little written about how. The work of transformation is really in engaging in the process. We're really writing about the mechanism in the brain that is actually responsible for creating that story. And the book is about teaching leaders, in essence, how to exercise that mechanism in the brain. I mean, Medcan as an organization, you're focused on wellness. So a lot of your listeners would understand that idea that, if I have a muscle that's out of shape, then I do certain exercises, I can strengthen that muscle and it can become kind of a more important and integrated piece of my own wellness. The narrator is really no different. So I think that's the distinguishing factor around the book is how to exercise that narrator and how to give it back its nourishment and its strength in order to create this leadership narrative and story that's going to be instrumental in a leader's effectiveness.
And I think one of the things that we recognized as we were, working with real executives over the course of writing this book is how incredibly challenging and difficult it can be to actually develop one's narrative. If you want true transformation, it's the process of developing one's narrative as a leader that actually leads to significant change. And we talk a lot about this in the book is that, it's not the product that actually is the most important thing. We're not helping leaders to write put together a presentation about their narrative or to write an essay about their narrative, although that's often sometimes what the outcome is. It's the process of actually getting there where the true transformation takes place. But you have to give them a framework in which they can feel safe to work in as they go through what is often a very challenging intellectual and an emotional process or journey.
So can we dig into that a bit? You talked about this difficult journey, and Christine, you talked about, I think the neuroscience behind this. Maybe we start there. What's going on biologically?
It's an interesting question. And we talk about the fact that narrative is the natural language of the mind. We have a section called the deep history of your narrator, which, borrows a lot on the work of people like Antonio Damasio, who is a very well-known, neuroscientist who's written a number of books on the development of the mind and the development of consciousness. One of the things that is very clear about the idea of narrative is that, we experience ourselves as a nonstop flow of images in our head. Damasio talks about the fact that if you take a very thin slice of our cortex, which is the most developed part of our brain, the neurons actually look like a grid, not unlike what you would see on an electronic billboard. And he says that it's the perfect structure to display images that are constantly moving and changing. And so, from an evolutionary standpoint, the biggest challenge, especially for higher order primates, was the ability to be able to organize those flow of images, because organizing those flow of images can mean the difference between, life and death, especially in big, complex social societies that primates live in. And so in order to be able to organize those flow of images so that, they could be useful in helping us to navigate our social and physical world is, we developed something that we would call a narrator. It's a process that, kind of like an orchestra conductor who has to organize the flow of music, actually organizes those flow of images into a story, a coherent story, which partly becomes the essence of how we see ourselves as individuals. So it's the core of our identity. Our narratives feed our identity, but our narratives also, give us important guidance in how to get along with other people and how to navigate our complex social world. And in particular, one of the findings of neuroscience is the very tip of our cerebral cortex. So if you were to put your index finger kind of just above your eyes, you would sort of be, touching, minus a bit of skin and bone, something called the frontal pole. The frontal pole is unique to humans in particular, and it's the area of the brain which processes highly complex information that comes from all different areas of the brain. It's the seat of our ability to think about our own thinking, so very higher order thinking skills, but also our ability to take information coming from different parts of the brain and organize those images much the same way that an orchestra will, organize the flow of music, as I said before, into a coherent story. So if we think of where our narrative process, or our narrator as we call it, it resides in probably the frontal pole. So we do make a distinction between the narrative process, which Christine mentioned earlier, is about strengthening that muscle. And, we'll talk a little bit later about how that muscle tends to get weakened, and the stories that it actually creates. And that's also something that is not talked about, is that there is a very clear distinction between the narrative process on the one hand and the stories that it creates on the other.
I take it children too have a narrative. Like you said, it's all this thoughts and senses and what you're experiencing, and it's being organized biologically. How do those narratives differ? In other words, is it purely based on what you're taking in, or can you be genetically pre-wired to have a different type of narrative about yourself?
Great question. One of the things that at least the literature would say is that these narrative processes develop in early adolescence. If you ask a young child, about what happened yesterday, they'll usually give you kind of distinct episodes. But when you start to ask children who are older about how their day was, they'll weave those distinct episodes into more of a story about what happened. Especially during our formative years, usually, our childhood, teens, and probably the early 20s, our narrator is online all the time because it's being fed by our environment. Parents and teachers are asking us who we want to be when we grow up. We're constantly thinking about, what do we stand for? What do we want to achieve? Who are we as people? We travel, usually in our early years, and start to realize that there's a bigger, broader world out there. But what starts to happen as we age is that people stop asking us, who we want to be when we grow up, in a simple way. And so as a result, those narrative processes start to recede into the background. They don't stop, but it's almost as if, your narrator kind of goes offline and stops growing and maturing. Christine, I know you and I have talked a lot about this as well.
Yeah, your narrator does. It recedes into the background, it goes offline, it stops growing, and life and this always-on environment and the pressure of working inside an organization almost becomes sort of the ready-made replacement of your narrator. And that's often where we meet executive leaders who have just found themselves at a crossroads in their career. And what does a crossroads look like? I mean, an obvious crossroads is, I've lost my job, or I'm thinking about leaving my job and making a career change. Like, those are the big crossroads that executive leaders might experience. But other crossroads are just things like, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm fatigued, I feel disconnected for some reason from my work. We do a ton of work with healthcare leaders. I can tell you they're tired. A clinical nurse manager in a hospital right now is probably at a crossroads of wondering, like, why did I choose to get into leadership in the first place? And that's where kind of much of the gap is. It's where many of executives kind of show up and say, I don't know where to go from here. I'm not sure how to get over this hurdle. For executive leaders, it can be lonely at the top. And that can be a crossroads for some. It's just that experience of feeling incredibly lonely and a large accountability for sort of big decisions that they haven't necessarily had to take on their own in a previous role.
The language that we use is that, narrative is your operating system, and it's in desperate need of an upgrade. And so giving them the sense that they already have within them is often very reassuring, but also quite empowering.
If you develop this narrative as a child, or it's more formative through your teenage and young adult life, and there's so many different narratives that people can have about themselves. But to what degree, when you're faced with change, in other words, the narrative that you have, you're challenged with it. You're an athlete, you're a soldier, you're a CEO of a startup, and it comes crashing down. And then you're faced with possibly an entirely new narrative that takes, I would imagine, a lot to disassemble what maybe you've previously built up to create some new narrative. Is that Is there some truth to that?
Yeah, there's some incredibly significant truth to that. And in fact, we work with leaders all the time, particularly in professions, right? So physicians, lawyers, where you've built your whole narrative and your whole identity as a leader around your profession. I'm a lawyer and I identify as a lawyer, or I'm a physician and I identify as a physician. And these individuals at certain points in their career might be thrust into a leadership role. Scientists are another group who would experience this. And when they're thrust into a leadership role, what many of them grapple with is this sort of old narrative and identity of being a scientist or a physician or a lawyer that's no longer sufficient and serving them in a leadership capacity. And it's this incredible period of transition, of feeling lost, of feeling disconnected for many of them, because they've sort of built this identity and been very successful in their profession. For many of them, it's their first experience of feeling incompetent at something or sort of ill-equipped to tackle something. And so, you want to talk about a crossroads, that's a significant one. People often ask us, like, well, what makes a good leader? Like, you can walk in any bookstore, you can find tons of books that are written on that subject, often written by people who've been in leadership roles, and it's really about their leadership experience. Some are based on neuroscience, many are very well research-based. But I think one of the things that we've done as a profession and as an industry is we've almost overcomplicated leadership. We've turned leadership into models and lists, right? Here's the 10 principles of a good leader. Here's the 8 competencies you need to be a leader. Now there's, here's the capabilities, which are different from competencies. These are the traits. These are the values. And we've almost made leadership something to study and inaccessible to people because it's just a list, but it doesn't really get at the heart. Exceptional leaders are those leaders for whom their core narrative, their core story of kind of who they are as an individual is their leadership narrative. And in fact, those two are integrated. The leaders that struggle are the ones that have a fragmented narrative where, I've got a narrative in this role, I've got a narrative in this role, and the two are not intertwined. The work of leaders has to be about bringing kind of all of our narratives together and integrating them.
Yeah, in the book, we have the story of Amal. Amal is a senior research scientist, a physician by training. She grew up as a woman of color in a foreign country. She was smart and excelled in school. And so very early on, her narrative began to form around the fact that she could be successful by relying on her own expertise and applying that expertise. But what she realized now was because she rose through the ranks and now all of a sudden, had been tapped on the shoulder to lead a group of global researchers, she kind of, as she said, she hit a bit of a wall. All of a sudden, her sense of self-confidence was lacking. She struggled, when she would come into the office every day and, trying to engage people, feeling, like I think a lot of executives certainly feel the sense of, an imposter phenomenon, but she was kind of experiencing it, at a significant degree. It wasn't that she needed more competency development. She was a very effective leader, but somehow whatever it was that she was doing was no longer working. Her narrative was very much based on her very strong achievement drive. And then it was, in fact, that narrative that was getting in her way because it helped her to succeed, during the first half of her career. But now where she was in a job which required complex influencing, being able to kind of align multiple agendas, being able to spend her time coaching and growing and developing others in ways that, went beyond what she was normally used to, she struggled. And so, through her work, recognizing, for example, that, in her early life, she had also been exposed to great inequities. So through her work, she began to develop kind of an expanded narrative, which, recognized that at the core of who she was she led because she wanted to address the inequities that she saw within her institution that she had never really addressed before. She was able to develop a much more complex and all-encompassing narrative that enabled her to break through, the challenges that she had been having in her self-confidence in her work.
What were the steps you helped her with to change this narrative or to enhance it or make her feel more effective?
We've created a narrator gym.
Yeah.
When I really think about what we've been spending the last kind of 3 or 4 years doing in our work with executives is we set out to create a narrator gym. And we've had this incredible fortune to work with literally dozens of leaders at the Narrator Gym. It's been a lot of fun. It's been incredibly rewarding, I think, for both Rick and I as two professionals who've worked in this industry for a long time and have always sought to create transformation. No different than, if I was to come into your gym and sort of say, I want to focus on strength and toning. I'm approaching my 50s. I want to make sure that into my 50s and my 60s, I've got sort of the foundational pieces to be able to continue to be strong and enjoy life and be active and whatnot. Then you would probably create a plan and you'd have a process for how you would help me to achieve those goals. The Narrator Gym is very, very similar. But if you can sort of distill it down, I think there are some high level guiding principles that we have found to be incredibly effective. So I would say the 3 guiding principles that Rick and I have really focused on and that are thread throughout that methodology are you've got to do some of the prep work and the foundational work to assemble the core building blocks. And these are often things that nobody asks us to think about. By the time we're in an executive role, we can sometimes see this stuff as not important. It's not concrete enough. So we just don't focus on it. We don't spend time there. But the building blocks are things like looking at those critical few life experiences, from early in life that have really shaped who you are. It's going back to, we have executives go back to old family albums, pull out mementos that have meaning to them. It's getting an outside-in perspective, but not the normal outside-in perspective. So, in a typical executive program, we do a 360. In fact, probably a lot of your listeners on this podcast have experienced a 360, right? It's competency-based. We go out, we ask for input from people, and usually the input is focused on identifying, some of our strengths, but also what are some of our gaps? What are some of the areas where we need to grow and develop? We're asking some very specific questions, which is, what is the unique value that I have created, in my leadership for you? So what impact, what are my strengths from your perspective, and what impact specifically have they had on you in my interactions with you to create something even more? Because narrative comes from kind of this core of strength. It also comes from this place of the legacy and the impact that we seek to create through our leadership. So the second guiding principle that we talk about is really finding the connections. It's this ability, and Rick, you always talk about the galaxy analogy, which is probably a good one to use here, but it is that ability to zoom in and zoom out, zoom back in, zoom out. And what you're looking for is how do these sort of seemingly disparate pieces of information weave together and create a pattern, a theme, a bigger picture. So, one of those guiding principles is assembling those building blocks. The second one is to kind of find the connections. The third one is to test your story with others. This isn't work that you do alone, and learning how to engage others in that story, learning what resonates, what comes off as authentic, and sort of having that feedback and others engage in the process. So it's not just all, Rick and me. We have another coach that does this work named Felix, but it's not all just us trying to bring that out. A lot of the work is actually the cohort sort of learning from one another and engaging one another in that process.
You have some leaders who are perceived to be our better leaders and others, who aren't. But could they not both have this really well-developed narrative? And can you changing your narrative affect your style of leadership or make you a more effective leader?
We certainly think so. Everybody has a narrative. Whether they're aware of it or not, that narrative is there. What leaders have said coming out of the process is the process doesn't so much change them as it does, it gives them a sense of grounding and anchor in who they are. It's wonderful to be able to see the transformation with the leaders that we've worked with, feeling like they've come home once again.
What do you say to leaders who have a major setback? They're publicly terminated, change a career, they may not have the same opportunity that they previously had. Have you worked with those individuals, and does this help them?
Very definitely. I mean, I think any traumatic experience like losing your job can be shattering to our internal narrative process. Our narrator is somewhat fragile. And so with a lot of the executives that we've worked with, what they also realize too, I mean, we talk about this in the book, one executive who actually had been, had lost her job as a result of a merger. She said, I feel like I've woken up after like the last 25 years that I have been allowing my organization to write my narrative for me. And so, first of all, it's helping leaders recognize that, they had sort of the phrase that I love that we've used in the book is, I allowed myself to be a passenger and not the pilot. So I think that, taking them back to the gym also means that, you're giving them the space and time to be able to figure this out. And that in and of itself can be very healing, I think, for leaders. If we allow organizations to write our narrative for us, those stories in and of themselves tend to be much more fragile because you lose your job, it shatters your story. And that story is not just something you're going to do in a weekend. It's something that is going to take you months to do, or several months to do. But in the process, you end up with something that is much more grounded in who you are.
Many of our listeners also struggle with their health and wellness journey. Can this play a role if you're the top exec? But, and some have a fanatical commitment to the gym and others can't find the time to get there and they struggle with weight and a whole host of issues. Is that something that you can coach? Can that be part of your narrative?
One of the things that we often talk about with leaders, in fact, it's funny, I literally just had this conversation with my daughter. She's a high school student. She struggles with OCD. She struggles with anxiety, and she struggles with a couple of other things. But she was writing a math test. She was ready for the math test. She went in to do her math test, and she has all these exceptions. She can write it in a resource room and have a quiet place, and she has noise canceling earphones and kind of all those things. And a kid who cares, right? Like deeply cares. And she had a panic attack during her math test. She was able to calm herself down. She was able to finish her math test. She missed her bus home from school as a result of going over time. She figured out on her own which of her parents' house to walk home from and how to kind of get back home to mine, which is a little bit of a further distance from the school. So she did all these things in the moment. But what I find fascinating about the mind is I think sometimes we're in a resourceful state of mind and other times we're in an unresourceful state of mind. And I think that, when we experience setbacks like hers, right? I'm in the middle of a math test. I can't figure out how to do a question. I was well prepared. I'm having a panic attack. It's very easy for us to slip into an unresourceful state of mind. And I think, our narrative becomes unresourceful in the moment. I think our narrator has gone offline. And sort of we're a product of this unresourceful state of mind. But what's funny was I sat in the car with her last night and talked to her about, well, hang on a second, like, let's forget about the math test for a second. Do you realize how many things that you achieved yesterday that 6 months ago you would never have done? Her whole body language changed. And it was like putting her narrator back online and back in charge of the narrative and getting her back to this resourceful state of mind, which is when we're in a resourceful state of mind, I think our cortex, we're better able to process what's happening and make better decisions. So, when I think of Dr. Macklin or when I think of Leslie Beck and the work that they do, I think the work they do is so important because I think the work they do is about helping their clients, their patients who are experiencing setbacks, get back to the resourceful state of mind. Like, put your narrator back online, put your narrator back in control of the narrative and the story you tell yourself about, why I'm on a weight loss plan in the first place and what it is that I'm trying to achieve and what's important and what aspects, what are the victories that I'm having along the way. So do I think it's related? Yeah, 100%.
That's very helpful.
In terms of your own narrative, Shaun, what would you say if you had to identify the one or two critical experiences or relationships that you've had that have really helped to shape, your view of yourself as a leader and, the values that you hold dear to you as a leader? What were those experiences that you feel have really shaped your own leadership narrative?
That's a great question, Rick. Maybe prefaced it or touched on it a little bit at the very beginning. I had the good fortune to go to the Naval Academy, which is a U.S. service academy for Navy Marine Corps officers, and get commissioned in the Canadian Army. And it is an amazing leadership. That's really all it does. What it does is if you have a base level of academic and physical qualification, you could be accepted. They're looking for potential, clearly, but they believe that they can develop leaders. Though, frankly, the higher up you go in the military, you also see authenticity eroding and exchange with climbing and sacrificing core values for politics. And that had probably a really profound effect on me, because I had the opportunity to not just be a leader, but to experience great leaders and not so great leaders in a laboratory almost. And I played sports as well. So I had the opportunities to experience, great coaches and not as great coaches. So I think that, that really affected me and started to form, my own narrative of what kind of leader I wanted to be. From there, I went into business, worked on Wall Street for a few years, and had the opportunity, frankly, to see terrible leadership. Meaning leadership didn't matter because you got paid a lot, which is in high contrast to the military. So those were probably seminal, experiencing the good and the bad and having opportunities to lead, not be successful, probably innately changing the narrative, seeking out ways to control my destiny. It's not super accidental that I'm in a business that, is health and wellness. I love that. It's retail too. So you touch on not just businesses, but we're dealing with individuals, which I really enjoy, but I'm also an owner. So that was really important to me because I didn't want to have a narrative or a set of values imposed on me that I may not agree with, but feel I might have to inauthentically promote them to promote the business or to advance myself. So there's a lot of threads in here. I also deal with a lot of veterans and other folks over time who have transitioned, and it's extremely difficult to transition from one career to another. So you can be a leader, like literally a decorated leader on the battlefield, and feel incredibly unqualified to succeed in the business world. It's fascinating, the psychology behind that, and that's influenced a lot of what I do and what I want to be or have the company be. My boys, 3 sons one is in the military and 2 are about to be in different branches of service. And I've encouraged that because I think it's at the junior level, it can be extremely influential at building your narrative as a leader. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but your work resonates with me.
Yeah, you are. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, Shaun, about your leadership, and we talk about it in the book, is this need for leaders, particularly at executive levels, to figure out how to kind of integrate and draw on what we would call socialized power in their leadership, which is this kind of need, energy, and desire to I'm trying to simplify really quick, but to make a positive impact on others. And when I think about how you describe yourself, and when I think about things that you do outside of your role, your leadership role at Medcan, I actually think that socialized power is core to who you are. I mean, I don't know you very well, but I think what I know of you is, even when you describe going to Harvard, and talking to veterans who are kind of in the middle of a period of disruption, it strikes me as you're there to make a positive impact on the lives of those people. Or if I think of your involvement in the Invictus Games, I mean, that to me is all kind of examples of drawing on socialized power, which we see as being core to effective leaders. And when you were talking about sort of in the military and kind of, moving away from authenticity, what you're describing is what we would call personalized power, which is this desire for sort of hierarchy and status, and that we seek status through our leadership as opposed to making a positive impact on other people. I mean, that's a generalization. It's not to suggest that someone who climbs the ranks doesn't have socialized power, but I think our coaching is around helping leaders tap into and draw upon that socialized power, that's part of the basis of authenticity.
I think it's a beautiful example of how your leadership narrative transcends your context. So, I think whether you're at Medcan or whether you will be somewhere else in your future, your leadership narrative, will transcend that. And as opposed to people whose narratives are often very fragile, that if, like as an example, if somebody were to turn around and you're no longer the CEO of Medcan, you'd be okay. It's not what defines you. It's the vehicle by which you are able to express your narrative. And that's what we mean by true, authentic leadership.
That's very insightful, Rick. We got to talk more.
Anytime.
Well, thank you both, Christine and Rick, for your time, and congratulations on your book. I think it's fantastic, and it's a great way to describe, this sort of mental framing that is so important in a way that's understandable. So I appreciate all of your comments this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was Shaun Francis, CEO of Medcan, in conversation with leadership consultants and authors Christine Miners and Rick Lash. Their new book, Once Upon a Leader, is out now.
Follow Shaun on Twitter and Instagram at Shaun C. Francis. That's Shaun with a U. And follow Medcan at Medcan Live Well.
We'll post episode highlights and links you can visit on our website at eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantal Gertian, Andrew Imex, and Emily Bozick. I'm executive producer Christopher Shulgin.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.